We're going to try to get this started. Good afternoon. We're gonna try to get this meeting called to order. That was pretty good, actually. I am impressed by that. All right, I don't know about that. Maybe it's that loud voice that my wife talks about, but we are. I believe that that the hearing we're going to be doing today is going to be a really insightful meeting. We're not taking up legislation. If you've seen the agenda, you know that we're going to be hearing some presentations today. We are looking at moving forward in the state of Georgia with criminal justice reform. It's going to be one of our big issues this year. There's some things that, a number of things that we're looking at with criminal justice reform, and while what we're looking at today is only a small part of that, I believe that if we're not careful, it could be an overlooked part of that. When we're looking at reentry issues, and we're looking at reducing the instances of recidivism, and looking at the barriers for those offenders to be able to assimilate back into society and be able to become the productive members that we want them to be. There are some obstacles that they have to overcome, and one of those obviously is a job. Another one obviously is housing. And today we're going to look at housing and look at how housing impacts our prison system, how housing impacts our jails, how housing impacts those offenders, and in many instances impacts people who are not yet offenders but are soon to be because of housing issues that they're facing within their community. We're going to get started right away, because just to be honest with you, if you think you're going to be out of here by 4 today, think again. I don't think we're going to make it by 4. We're going to go a little bit beyond that. I'm not going to let us go beyond 4:30, but we're going to go beyond 4 today. Michael Nell is with the board of. Michael Nell's with Parole and Pardon and Parole, and he's going to present first and share with us some of the issues that they are facing with the prison population and those who are looking to be getting out and back into society, and the issues we're facing with housing. So we're going to turn first to Michael. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee.
Can we get some lights back on, please?
Yeah. I was a little concerned the presentation hadn't even started, but Mr. Chair.
But I'm sure that you're going to give us a lights out presentation.
I hope so. That's my desire, and let me thank you and the committee on behalf of the Pro Board to be here and present on this issue. Before I get started, I do want to take a moment just to introduce a few individuals from Parole. Marta Daniel is here. Many people in the room know her. Have Scott Maurer along with us, Cynthia Sneed, and of course Rita Rocker. So they're the team that truly makes this happen. What I'd like to do today very briefly is talk about specific housing needs as it relates to the parole population and the impact it has on the prison population, specifically amongst sex offenders, offenders with mental health issues and illnesses, substance abusing offenders, and then finish it up talking about an overview of our residential our problem housing partnership that we have. I believe you got a copy of the presentation there before you.
I think we do.
Okay.
And committee members, if you have any questions as we go, if you would just jot down a note to yourself about those questions. We're gonna go through the presentations, and we're going to hear from everybody before we take any questions. And so presenters, if you would just make yourself available, and we'll do all questions at the end.
Absolutely. Certainly will. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Historically, the Parole Board, before they have decided to parole someone and release them, part of the requirement was that they have housing lined up so that when they're released, they have somewhere to go. We know research shows us that there's 2 key elements. Roof over your head and a job. Those are the two biggest things you can do to help for successful transition. With the prison situation being at 107% capacity, we've had to look at internal processes to address that. We now no longer require a residence. What we do is we will release back to the county of conviction unless there's a banishment order, and we utilize our parole officers to find suitable residency. Now, this sounds crazy, and somebody will say, duh. It is so much easier to find a place to live when you are not behind bars. But here's the truth of that. They can open up and make reconnections with family members and friends far easier from the outside and with the parole officer helping to facilitate that. So that was one thing that we had found as we began to release and facilitate changes. I mentioned that we're going to talk about sex offenders and the mental health population and then substance abusers. When we talk about sex offenders, currently we've got 367 cases that have been granted parole. The parole board has said you're good to go, but they cannot secure a residence. So that makes a challenge. So that's 367 inmates that if they had somewhere to go, they could be released. Here's some of the problems with those cases. Many of them have a 1,000-foot restriction that prevents that, makes it very challenging. Some have, for lack of a better phrase, burned their bridges. They have nowhere else to go. And there are also few housing providers that are willing to accept sex offenders. Some of the things that we have done internally, when the law was changed and there were some that could be eligible and the 1,000-foot proximity didn't apply, we actually went, reviewed all those cases and sent them back to the parole board for consideration. While it did have an impact, it did not have a significant impact because those cases were not as abundant. So when you ask what is needed as we talk about sex offenders, it's basically housing that's affordable, because many of these sex offenders have court-ordered treatment, they have polygraph exams, and electronic monitoring, so the affordability is very important. Also one that's available to public transportation for employment and to attend counseling, and of course, as I mentioned, in compliance with a 1,000-foot restriction. I will share this with you. I've been in this business going on 24 years now and was with corrections about 21 and a half years, and when I saw this, I was quite surprised because I was looking at it from a practitioner standpoint, and we would think you would never want to house sex offenders together. Well, research is actually starting to show that if you house sex offenders together that are in treatment and abiding by their conditions of treatment, it can actually contribute to success. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. That was kind of news to me as we were researching this. So then we talk about our offenders with mental health illness, and we talk about mental health carrying a lot of challenges with it, not just in the prison system, but also out in the community. One thing to consider is costs for mental health inmates who require medication and periodic treatment typically cost twice as much. So when we talk about these offenders not being able to be released because they have somewhere to go, keep in mind these offenders are not costing you your typical $48 a day. They're usually costing you twice as much to house them because of the treatment and medication that is required. Right now in that category, we have 147 cases that have been granted parole, but there's not a residence identified. So you add that with the sex offenders, you add 147 onto that. Also, most mental health cases are not eligible for disability benefits. They can be eligible for Social Security supplemental income. And as you may suspect, oftentimes with mental health offenders, some are aggressively non-compliant after years of conflict. Much like sex offenders, family members are no longer willing to provide a residence because of the challenge associated with them. There's another significant challenge in keeping these offenders as we talk about residential needs in the community. Right now we have over 500 parolees that have serious mental health issues. And what is needed for stability for mental health cases is, of course, a stable residence. Then you've got to have good oversight with those particular offenders, looking into eligibility of federal government benefits, making sure the medication is taken, making sure the medication is obtained. When they leave prison, they've got to continue that medication, and that's important. You got to make sure doctor appointments are scheduled and attended, and then, of course, transportation to get to and from the doctors and treatment. Of course, addition of well-managed housing for mental health parolees will reduce these cases that would be unable to parole, and, of course, prevent them from being returned to prison or certainly contribute to their success. So we've talked about sex offenders, we've talked about mental health, and then we'll talk about a large population that we all are aware of, and that's the substance abusing offenders. Offenders with drug addictions and substance abuse addictions are the most common and probably the largest in the parole population. I think statistically nationwide, 80% of offenders have some type of substance abuse issue that either contributed directly or indirectly with the offense for which they're sentenced under. Interestingly enough, in 2006, alcohol and other drugs were involved in 78% of violent crimes, 83% of property crimes, and 77% of public order, immigration, weapon offenses, or pardons and paroles and probation violations. Now here's the encouraging part of that. Every $1 spent on treatment saves approximately $3 in crime-related cost.
Can you say that one more time, please?
I can. Every dollar spent on treatment saves $3 in crime-related cost, increase earnings, and also reduce health care. Certain parole addictions are met by recovery groups that we currently utilize, but there's certainly more that are needed on an intensive basis. Continuing with our substance abuse issue with offenders, we currently use federal funds, and it enables us to provide a 6-month community residential substance abuse treatment program to 64 eligible parolees in 7 districts.
I know I said I was going to hold questions at the end, but I do want to ask one question here.
Yes, sir.
On these parolees, are they can these individuals go to faith-based treatment programs, or does it have to be programs that are not faith-based?
I will let Marta, if you don't mind answering that one, because I certainly don't want to give you misinformation.
The federal funds that we are using for this particular program, it's part of the Edward Byrne Memorial Grant, and we have to use programs that are licensed by the state to provide addiction treatment, and that therefore we are not able, that agency does not license faith-based programs where the faith-based component is a requirement of participation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Here is something that's encouraging with our community residential substance abuse treatment. 60% of those involved have successfully completed the program. That may not sound all that great, but it is when on the national average it's 46%. So that shares that it is in fact working. Therefore, you're reducing the number of parolees returning to prison, and it increases cases that contribute to their families and communities. As you well know, while it may be about the parolee, there's also a family there. There's children that are dependent on it. There's spouses that are depending on it. So it really does have a far-reaching effect. Unfortunately, because of limited funding, we can't expand these to the other 39 parole districts, and parolees typically don't have health insurance, nor can they pay for it out of their pocket, as you might suspect. One thing I do want to bring up is that the funds that are supporting this will expire September 2012. When we talk about our substance abusing offenders, certainly additional funding to increase and sustain the successful community residential substance abuse treatment program is needed. Also funding for stable and drug-free structured residence. for parolees, one of the very issues we're here to discuss today. For those parolees that perhaps are performing poorly in those recovery groups and need something a little bit more intensive. Otherwise, the chances are very good that they're going to end right back up in prison, costing us those precious beds. Finally, Mr. Chair and Committee, I wanted to talk about a success story regarding the Residential Problem Housing Program, also known as RPH. I wish I could take credit for this. I was at Corrections when this came about. It was a joint effort between the Parole Board, the Department of Corrections, and Department of Community Affairs to address specifically the housing needs. It uses limited federal funds, and through this program, offenders are placed in approved housing facilities throughout the state. Now, one of the challenges, few of these housing except the mentally ill cases and sex offenders are not allowed in this RPH. If you remember at the beginning of this presentation, we talked about having well over 300 sex offenders that have been paroled if they simply had somewhere to go, and unfortunately sex offenders are not part of this program. And there are valid issues with that, the 1,000-foot restrictions, as well as possible abuse to other residents. So there are some legitimate concerns. But I wanted to share with you some stats that in FY 2011, 44 approved housing providers participate in this program. There have been 594 offenders placed in RPH, and we have paid $874,000. That's a lot of money. But if this program did not exist and these inmates stayed incarcerated, it would have cost $5.3 million for that time frame. Now, I'm not in the business community, but I would like to get part of an investment that would give you that kind of return on your money. So when you talk about investments, for $874,000, you're able to have a cost avoidance of $5.3 million. So it is an excellent and worthwhile program, there's no doubt. And in that need, the greatest need is continuing the funding with newly released offenders without a residence so we can get to this population. I know that was a quick overview. Mr. Chair, I didn't know how you wanted to handle questions. I will be here as long as you want me to be, as well as my teammates. But that concludes our portion of the presentation.
Here, I tell you what, here's what I'd like to do. Committee members, if you have a pressing question for Mr. Nail, I'll take a pressing question right now. I'm not going to take many questions because here's one of the things that I anticipate happening as we go through and hear from 3 or 4 different presenters is I think that that some of the questions may be answered by other presenters, and I also think that as we get information from 3 or 4, it may change our perspective on some of the questions we may be asking anyway. So if you have something pressing, I'll take that. If not, just jot down a note, and we'll bring our presenters back up and make them available at the end. Anybody have anything pressing? Okay.
Very well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Nell. Appreciate that very much. And Mr. Nell closed the presentation by talking about the RPH program and a partnership with DCA to do the RPH program. And we're going to have Don Watt come at this time with DCA. And if you'll come and share with us a little bit more about the RPH program and in any other housing programs or issues that you see that you'd like to share with us as well, we would appreciate that very much. Thank you, Mr. Watt, and if you don't mind, introduce to us your assistant as well.
I certainly will. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here today. Again, my name's Don Watt. I'm the director of our Office of Special Housing Initiatives at the Georgia Department of Community Affairs. And I have with me Patricia Wright, who is our finance manager within the State Housing Trust Fund for the Homeless. Patricia is responsible for administering our part of the reentry program that we operate in partnership with the Board of Pardons and Paroles and the Department of Corrections. We've been a partner to this program since its inception. Our role really is very limited. We actually act as an administrative agent for the program, with the bulk of the work is being done by our partners over at the Department of Pardons and Paroles and the Department of Corrections. In the handout, you'll see that the Board of Pardons and Paroles employs a housing coordinator who's responsible for the program application review, communication with providers and participating parolees, the identification of parolees to participate in the program, inspecting and certifying the residences that are part of the program, facilitating the release plans for the parolees, and then coordinating with the Georgia Department of Corrections with their reentry residential coordinator. The Board of Pardons and Paroles is really responsible for all of the interaction that goes on directly with the parolee and with a housing provider. They are the main contact with the housing provider. The Department of Corrections plays a similar role. They're identifying potential individuals to participate in the program, helping to identify housing providers, tracking statistical data, and such. DCA really is involved for one primary, or really two primary reasons. As the operator of the programs under the State Housing Trust Fund for the Homeless, we have the experience in working with nonprofit housing providers, faith-based housing providers, and for-profit organizations, so that we're able to qualify those organizations in accordance with the requirements of state of Georgia law. But probably most importantly, the State Housing Trust Fund for the Homeless is authorized by the Georgia Constitution to contract with faith-based organizations. So that enables us, and I think we're maybe the only or one of the very few state entities can actually enter into contracts with faith-based organizations. Based on our current contracts right now, we actually have 35 entities that are under contract, with 30 active since July. And you can see that of those 30, 9 are faith-based providers. And we've got providers in 13 different counties, mainly in the Atlanta metro area, but also in Savannah, Atlanta, Macon, and then Tift and Toombs counties. DCA is responsible for reviewing program applications for organizational compliance, financial stability, and then also local jurisdictional compliance, ensuring that the proposed location is in compliance with local zoning laws, as well as that there is a letter from the local unit of government supporting the application that is proposed. Since the program's inception, we've spent over $2.7 million to assist 1,700, almost 1,800 inmates. And with that, there's been a cost avoidance in total as of June 30th of $38.6 million. And one thing that I would like to just kind of point out is that the program actually received a national award from our National Organization of Housing Finance Agencies back in 2008. In general, though, ex-offenders, as you can imagine, there are several impediments that impact in just obtaining housing generally. No credit history or poor credit history is always an issue. Tenant selection policies at different residential projects often exclude individuals with certain criminal offenses. The startup costs to form a household, having that first month's rent, the utility deposits, and just the basic cost of household setup. Access to transportation to get to services and employment, and then having sufficient income, potentially with SSI, to be able to live independently. And the reentry program helps to solve some of those issues. Interestingly, as a provider of funding to the different homeless organizations in the state, we were able to pull from our database information about impediments that existing homeless individuals at the 24/7 Gateway Center down the street are affected with. They've had 3,725 clients currently in the system, and of those, almost 1,500 identified some barrier information with accessing housing. And some of those barriers, quite honestly, as you would expect, included criminal offenses. 39% were convicted of a misdemeanor, 27% were felonies, and 13% were probation. And those individuals identified those as a barrier to accessing affordable housing. I am pleased to be able to say that one additional other project that we've initiated is a website database that's called at georgiahousingsearch.org. And what that website is a database of affordable rental housing opportunities located across the state. And you can search that database by a variety of different mechanisms or search criteria. But in doing a quick search this morning, we identified that, right now that there are over 1,200 units in that system that currently do not require a credit check at that property. 1,257 that don't require a criminal background check, and almost 800 that don't require either. So we're very pleased with that. That's a resource that can be used by our partners, the service providers that we work with, our homeless organizations, to try to match housing opportunities. So we think that's a good resource.
You say in your notes that these are units that are available.
They are available.
I'm assuming that these are not units that are empty, but rather the total number of units available.
Yeah.
What's your vacancy rate? Do you have any clue or idea about that?
Well, the units that come up on any type of search that we do requires that the unit be vacant. Each of the systems, each of the property managers or owners are required to go through and update this information about those units twice a month, every 2 weeks. Otherwise, that information is taken out of the system. And only those units that are available for rent or will be available for rent in the very near future will show up as an available unit to be occupied by an individual. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you. And on behalf of Commissioner Beatty, thank you, I think.
Well, let me ask another question following up on that. Do you all have relationships with these 1,200 units that are presently available, or is this just a search of everything that's out there?
It's a search of every provider that has put their information into the system. So we do not have a relationship with every organization or entity.
Okay. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2, I guess you're talking about the 35 entities that you have contracts with. What
Yes.
exactly are you contracting them with for? These are actual units, or?
Yeah, I'm sorry. In the program, we contract to provide room and board for a period of 3 months. Okay, so we are contracting with them for that purpose.
And we're actually paying the rental on
We're paying
the units, or are we paying them to hold them for the offenders to pay for them?
We're paying the room and board for the 3 months, so we're actually paying for that 3-month period.
And how much are we spending on that? Those
For-
contracts. How much are those contracts
It's
for?
$600 a month that
Per
they would
unit?
get paid per unit for room and board. Correct. So it's a maximum of $1,800 for each individual that's enrolled into the program.
And is that included in your dollars on page 3 on total money spent in the APH program?
Yes.
And how long has the RPH program been in?
Do you remember when it started? 2006.
Look, and the reason I'm going down this is the same thing I was thinking I wanted to ask Mr. Nail when he was up here is, you put out statements like for every dollar you spend on treatment, you save $3 in avoidance and all that. And I'm just wondering, where the real dollars are, how many employees you have, how much we're spending on this. There's a lot that goes into this, and I'm just not real sure, how it all comes together and why DCA is even involved with the Department of Pardons and Parole, and that why you can't just hand it over to them and give them the list. I'm just not understanding the connection here. Maybe I'm missing something.
Okay. Patricia, you want on the amount of dollars that we spend?
The money that Don had in his presentation, the $2,000,007, is just the amount that's paid for the offender, the $1,800 maximum for each one. In addition, we receive 7% admin for the program. That covers a portion of my cost. I do all the review of the applications. We also have a person who processes up to 5,000 invoices that we've done since the program began. So that's kind of our basic role. Because of our ability to contract with faith-based organizations, that's how we became involved in the project. Pardon and Parole did not have the ability to do that. And when the program was first discussed, there was a feeling amongst the people who met and first designed the program that there would be a lot of participation by faith-based organizations.
All right, so we don't have this big bureaucratic, organization on DCA. We're talking about 3 employees?
Yes. Well, there's actually, 3 people who kind of touch the program at our agency.
It's probably less than 1 full-time employee.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Davis. Did you say 7% admin? So total, you're still looking at less than, what, 3 million probably. That's and it would have cost us $38 million to have kept them in prison during that time rather than releasing them through this program.
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else have a pressing question for Mr. Watt? Thank you, Mr. Watt.
You're welcome.
When we're talking about housing issues, whether it's the housing issue offenders face in trying to get out of prison and find that place of housing. And by the way, these offenders who have reached parole are eligible to go, and some of those, I'm sure, never find housing and end up maxing out eventually. And at that point, we have to let them go whether they have any place to go or not. Is that correct? Mr. Nell's shaking his head yes. So some of those offenders end up on the streets, whether it's because of mental illness or because of addiction or whatever the case may be. And as those offenders are on the streets, they many times become repeat visitors in our county jails. Some individuals with addiction, developmental disability, mental illness, who may not have been in the prison system, still are those who are finding the local jail to be a place that they frequent, and nobody knows that better than our sheriffs. And we have with us today Kim Kimbrough, Sheriff of Clayton County. Thank you for coming. If you'd like to come and share with us some of your experiences there in Clayton County, and how some of these housing issues with the mentally ill, developmental disability, substance abuse individuals, how these individuals are impacting your jail, and maybe some of the things that you try to do to address with that. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Chairman Neal, and ladies and gentlemen of the committee. I appreciate your indulgence in listening to this issue and hearing it, and certainly the local perspective is one that I think will help flesh out a lot of the details. I didn't bring fancy PowerPoints and charts and graphs. My days as a paid lobbyist are on suspension right now. That's right. I may very well appear before you again in that capacity at some point in the future. But for right now, I'm the sheriff in the county, and there are a number of dimensions upon which this issue touches my day-to-day action. And let me say I'm here speaking kind of anecdotally about what's going on in my county. But I'm sure that other sheriffs face the same issues. In Clayton County, my jail population hovers around 1,700 on any given day. Our record low, I think, was about 1,400. Thanks to the Department of Corrections, they found us some beds, and I was eternally grateful. But we're back up to about 1,700 today. And every time we get into a discussion of alternative programs, funding for that particular purpose is always our limitation. We have a drug court program that this legislature has appropriated monies for in the past. Thank you for that. But our drug court program is limited at 30 participants. Out of 1,700 folks I've got in jail, and an initial screening shows that we could have up to 300 folks that would meet drug court parameters, but for one component. There's one very key factor, and it is that they have stable residential housing outside of the jail. That's number one thing that'll get them knocked out. If they don't have a place to stay that's stable, then they are not eligible for the drug courts program. In that same vein, when we start to look at just some of the simple issues about mental health, depending on which figure you ascribe, 50 to 60% of the people that I have incarcerated have some mental health issue that contributes to their alleged criminal activity. And we are one of the largest mental health providers certainly in our county, if not in the metro area. When we began looking at creating a mental health housing unit to deliver intensive services to the folks we have incarcerated that aren't going to go anywhere, very quickly about 300 to 400 people were identified as folks who could be consumers for an intensive level of services, and that's not counting the other individuals that have some level of need. I think we have 900, I think that was the number that was presented to me, about 900 inmates who are receiving some level of mental health treatment while they're incarcerated. So, you know, I won't try to repeat what Mr. Nail said, but the studies about spending money more effectively and more efficiently, I think apply not only at the state level, but they apply at the local level. Indeed, I was happy that Governor Deal said that he was going to extend the work of the Special Counsel for Criminal Justice Reform so that sheriffs could be more involved with that process as we go forward, because we're at one end of a pressure valve. And it's not to say that the state's issues are not important. They are. They are very important. But you also have to deal with the issues on the front end because there's a lot of people who are kind of going through a sifting and straining process in the court, in the county jails and in our local courts before they even touch ground in the Department of Corrections system. We have some providers in the county who do offer the sorts of resources that we're talking about here, and most of them operate under contract with the State Department of Corrections. And we have seen success, in my opinion, because I think that from a public safety standpoint, we do have to recognize that at some point in time, they are going to max out their sentences. They're coming back to the community anyway, whether they have stable housing or not. And if they come back without stable housing, then they're coming right back to the county jail, regardless of the driver, whether it is mental health, substance abuse, or some other factor. A lot of it is just the housing environment. They may very well have quote-unquote stable housing, but it's stable housing that is lodged in the middle of all of the factors that led them to offend in the first place. We can get you clean, sober, on your meds and everything else, and if we send you back to the house where there is no order, all of the people that are around you are engaged in drug activity, no one is checking on you to make sure you are taking your meds, all of those things are going to put that person right back into the mix. They're coming back to the county jail. And indeed, I don't have hard figures to give you, but certainly you would understand that we have our frequent flyers. We have the people that we see all the time. We know them by name. They come to the jail. They already know the routine. You know, I need to get my spork, my bin, my blanket. You know, deputy, I'll help you with that. Let me take my stuff to the cell. I mean, we have that population, and it's sad because when they are in custody and we do have them under therapeutic care, they are model inmates. We have an inmate workforce that does work for us, works in our kitchen, our laundry, and helps us keep the facility clean and orderly. We have about 400 inmates at any given time that are on that status. And all of those folks, if you have the time to sit down and talk with them, they all tell that story. And we're spending god-awful amounts of money to keep them behind bars when the reality is we could probably spend less money to support them in treatment, support them in housing, get them back out into the community, and actually maybe even rehabilitate them into quality citizens. There are bad people in the world. I'll never be one to deny that, and as sheriff, it's my job to keep the bad people away from the good people. But we've got a a certain segment of the population that's kind of caught up in limbo. They are good folks, but they have issues. Those issues could probably be addressed more effectively than with concrete and plexiglass. And I just want to add my weight of support in what we're talking about here, that if we look at supportive housing as a more cost-effective way to deal with just that segment of the population. It's not the answer to the entire criminal justice mix, but it is the answer to that population. And Clayton County, just to answer that part of the question, because I know that was also asked. Clayton County, like many local governments, I mean, we're going through the same budget crises that the state is going through. Our tax revenues are also shrinking. We're having to do more with less. And certainly as a sheriff, I have to balance my budget according to kind of 4 major programs that I'm working. Actually 5 at this point. I have to take care of my courts. I have to take care of my patrol. I have to take care of the schools. I have responsibility for schools, as well as take care of the jail. And so there's not a whole lot of stuff left over for me to engage in exploring and examining supportive housing based alternatives to detention. One of the things that we lost actually before I became sheriff, before I was elected, but we had it when I worked at the sheriff's office before, was we had a work release program. And that work release program was incredibly effective. But again, it was limited by budgetary constraints at the time. At the time, we had 100 beds. All of the offenders that were screened through the process that were assigned to the work release program basically paid their own room and board. They had to have a job, but we provided the housing. They were supervised. They could only leave the facility to go to work. We gave them a little bit of family time, and they came back and stayed with us the remainder of the time. We were actually, by court order, we were in charge of their finances, so their paychecks were paid into their inmate accounts, and we dispersed those monies so that we paid off all their obligations to the court. We paid off all their restitution to victims, made any other disbursements that were necessary, and so we kind of helped make the process whole. In many regards, that was a supportive housing operation. We provided that housing component, but yet everything else, we tried to help get these folks back on path. And we were in the process. We were one of those kind of fortunate, I guess, counties in that we had an old jail that was still in operation or still in operational condition. And when we moved into our new jail, we were rehabilitating that facility so that we could take our work release program from 100 beds to 500 beds. And that just kind of never came to fruition due to the prevailing winds of politics and circumstance. Other counties, I think Cobb County and Gwinnett both have very large, robust work release programs, and I think that if we were to bring data from them, they would also show stories of success. And I'm trying to get my county into a position where we can operate a work release facility on that level again. Our challenges are our initial upfront capital. The revenue will sustain our operations. So that's not an issue, but our problem is the capital to actually finance a building. And I think on the front end right now, the lowest estimate I've been able to get on a suitable facility is about $10 million. And of course, $10 million is quite a substantial chunk of money to get our hands on to erect a facility of this nature. But I think that it would easily pay itself off inside of 10 years. And the kind of facilities we're talking about, they're going to be on the ground longer than 10 years. And I think that over time, they're going to change the nature of our recidivism. They're going to change the nature of our operations and how we do business, and probably change the nature of our community.
Thank you, Sheriff. You mentioned this population that when they're in your custody and under your control are model inmates, and their addiction, they're clean, they're taking their meds, so their mental illness is not an issue. And these are I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's one of the most important things as we're looking at this criminal justice reform. Is there are so many people, and I would assume that you would agree that it's a growing number, a growing population, that are behaving criminally as a result of addiction or mental illness, that aren't criminally minded people.
Sure.
And if we can address their addiction and address their mental illness, and we can give them the supportive housing that they need, and those individuals want to be a part of of society just as much as we do. And they're unable to because of those hindrances, and some of them may be some family circumstances, so many different things that can contribute to that. Mm-hmm. But if we can address those issues, and I believe we can do it cheaper than we can incarcerate them. If we can address those issues for them, they too want to be not just model inmates, but model citizens.
I would agree, and one of the things that I didn't bring it here today, but we did a cost-benefit analysis for how much it would cost to increase the drug court's capacity to 300 versus what it would do for my budget to take 300 inmates out of the population. And the numbers were on the order that Mike talked about, and that also that DCA talked about, that we're talking about anywhere from a 5-fold to 10-fold decrease in our operational expenditures. And I think that's the real story. It won't solve everything. We can't do away with jails. Jails are necessary because there are bad people. But we have an opportunity to save millions of dollars, literally millions of dollars. My jail budget, just if you look at my big ticket items in the jail, I spend anywhere from $7 to $8 million on health care alone every year. I spend anywhere from $2 to $3 million just to feed all the inmates. We usually book about 26,000. We did 26,000 this year, which is actually low. We booked 32,000 last year through our facility, and every one of those folks, we have a duty and responsibility to feed and care, clothe, house, provide everything for them. And I would dare say, out of that $7 to $8 million of medical care, we're spending millions of dollars on medication. And that's been a long-standing issue that we've tried to we've worked very closely with the Department of Corrections to try to enjoy bulk spending discounts and the like, but we're still spending a lot of money on this.
Okay, you're lighting up the board. I think we have a number of people with pressing questions. We're going to go ahead and start with Representative Davis. He seems to always be first.
Always. I'm an inquisitive person, Mr. Chairman. Sheriff, thank you so much for being here and giving your expertise on this, because it really does make a difference when we're making decisions down here. As we're talking about housing and that, I had some sex offender registry questions, and how you're interacting, and if that is improving with the GBI as with we gave them some grant money last year to improve their and how the interaction's going with that. And also, if you're aware that the governor's putting forth some change to the SORB situation, bringing it under GBI from the behavioral health, and just basically how are you managing that situation right now with your monitoring of the sex offenders, and is it improving, and is there anything else that we can do at this point to help with that situation?
One of the big things, and thank you for that question, I certainly believe that cooperation with the GBI is a helpful thing because of their understanding of our business, if nothing else. One of the big things that I wish we could do better, and it's something that funding is lacking for at the local level, but I think that if we did it on a statewide basis, we would have greater opportunities to engage in economies of scale, is how we communicate that information to the public. And I think there's a company right now, I don't mean to get into something that sounds almost like a procurement discussion, but there's a company that is engaged with a large number of my fellow sheriffs, Offender Watch, that takes their data and makes it easily accessible to the public so that people can monitor for themselves the activity of the sex offender community. But somehow or another that hasn't turned into a statewide thing. And we used to have a statewide effort along that line, and I think that when GBI went through some of their budget cuts, that was one of the things that they let go. So each one of us as sheriffs, we do put forth the effort to communicate to our citizens where the sex offenders live, and we monitor that and we keep it updated. But we're spending a lot of money on that. And also, it just depends on I have a roster posted in the courthouse. I have a roster posted in my office. I think there are several locations where we have it. We have it on our website. We even went so far as to, put a nice fancy GIS map up and everything for that map. But what we do may not be the same thing as the next county over or the next county over, the next county over. And certainly those folks who have been able to engage with Offender Watch does a whole lot of other neat fancy tricks for them, but that's something that, I guess every community has to make that spending decision. I wish we could do that on a larger basis and do it for everybody so that everybody gets the same level of attention and communication. On the backside, in terms of the verification, we're another one of those very busy counties. We've got about 300 sex offenders in Clayton County. We have some issues in terms of not to take sympathy on them. They did what they did and they deserve what they deserve. But the way Clayton County is built out, we are, I think, the third smallest land area county, but we are the fifth most populous county. There really isn't a place for a sex offender to live in Clayton County, but because of the way the law was drafted and the constitutional issues that are involved, we can't make them all leave. I'm sure that at the end of their life expectancy, we'll have a great time in Clayton County. No new sex offenders can move there, but the ones who live there, they're a walking violation, pretty much.
What about out-of-state offenders that are moving in? Are you, how are you classifying them and determining whether or not their residency is applicable to our state laws?
We do a physical verification. And of course, that's almost a self-policing function, because unless I'm dealing with a state that is really kind of on the ball, gives me great information ahead of time, and everything matches up, I have a compliant offender as well as really great information, then we can make all that work. If they relocate on their own, or the other state is behind and they're not really focused on sex offender monitoring, it can get out of whack. I've had people show up that we weren't expecting. I've also had people that we've expected and haven't seen, and we had to go out and look for them. And we do that. I have a regular dedicated staff that does nothing but sex offender monitoring. That's all they do all day long, every day. Their job is to go out and monitor these 300 folks. And we try, using extra manpower, we try to get a hard verification on every sex offender every 30 to 60 days. Which with 300 offenders, that's a whole lot of work when I've got other work that needs to be done.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and we're going to work on getting all the offenders classified. So maybe you can prioritize those monitoring efforts as well. So we're working on it.
Sure. Thank you very much.
We have several more questions, and Sheriff, if you don't mind, if you could shorten your answers just a little bit for us.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I'll work on that.
It's not that I'm not interested in what you have to say, but we're going to run out of time, I'm afraid, if we're not careful. I certainly appreciate you being with us and appreciate your thoughts in these areas. Representative Chokas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Sheriff, thank you for being here. I appreciate your presentation. I wish you'd give me a little bit more detail about the $10 million that will be needed for a facility for housing. Are y'all looking for that type of facility? Is that something that you think would be cost effective? And you said something that y'all have some fees or revenue that would service that facility. The direction I'm going in is if you thought of any type of public-private partnership
I have, and we've explored that. One of my challenges in that regard has just been my partnership with the other governments that have to be involved. And when I say that, I talk about my Board of Commissioners. My Board of Commissioners, a lot of good folks who are elected, but they've got a lot of different directions they're pulled in, and standing behind the sheriff while we float a bond to try to build a work release facility is just not high on their priority list. I've tried to convince them that on the backside, they would save money, but they've got a lot of stuff on their mind, and so that just doesn't rise to the level of their consciousness. We got that information based upon just talking to a number of facility designers, and we just got some rough estimates from each of them on what it would take to build a 500-bed facility of a certain character and with certain features that needed to be in it. So $10 million roughly shook out. If we charged, I think, $20 a day for 500 beds and we kept it fully occupied, which I have no doubt that we would have any problem doing that, I want to say our initial revenue estimate is $2.7 million a year. I think we only needed to have about $1 million or so of that to operate it, put another $1 million or so of that in the debt service, and then we've got some wiggle room to enhance our services and go bigger. And that's very conservative in terms of what we would need to put into it. So that's what I mean when I say it would pay for itself. We could pay the debt service on it and within 10 years have the facility paid off. And none of that money comes off the backs of the taxpayers. Plus we support the operations that are there. But our problem is on the front end is that we are going to have to incur the debt or come up with the cash money to build that facility. And it's more of a will problem, I think, than a skill problem.
Thank you.
Representative Buckner.
My question's real similar. Your story prompted a memory for me, $1 Million Murray, that was written by Malcolm Gladwell, and it cost us $1 million to not do something. And,
Yes, ma'am.
and so I appreciate that you recognize that. And I was really going to ask a similar question. So many times when we talk about these things, we don't talk about how they can be coordinated or collaborated with some of the health providers, because the same costs that you are incurring for public safety, there are an awful lot of healthcare costs that are being incurred, and they're the same people. And I was just wondering if there was any attempt to collaborate so that the facility could be done in a collaborative manner and maybe, you know.
Sure. I think one of the things that has been a challenge in terms of facilities and that sort of thing is just everybody, in the wake of the Olmstead decision and the subsequent, consent orders and different judgments that we have happened after that, we don't want to do a facility because we want to do something community-based.
Like
Now, on the flip side of that, we've got plenty of private providers who want to engage in that sort of work. Plenty. I think the issue is trying to get them all in the same place, organize a program, and disperse the funds in an organized manner, but have standards that meet our needs. And that's, again, something that can be done. It's just undertaking the heavy lifting to get it done, and then actually put the political will behind it to move forward and actually do it. We have all sorts of success stories. But it only takes one bad story to kind of tear all that down. And I'll give you a perfect example. Holly Tree is a facility that's in Clayton County. Great work being done there. They give us no trouble. Matter of fact, very collaborative staff, cooperative staff. We are, as we speak, kind of on the cusp of building relationships and trying to do things. But then I've got 2 or 3 people who have a private house and have somehow or another entered into some sort of engagement with someone to serve as a halfway house. Hadn't told anybody, is not working with anyone, and as soon as something bad happens at that residence, that's what hits the evening news. That's what turns everybody sour to the idea of transitional housing or the idea of residential treatment. We've got great success stories. No one talks about those things. They only focus on the negative things. And that sometimes is discouraging. Like I said, that contributes to our political will problem.
Representative Kidd.
Very briefly, I'll be, Mr. Chairman. A lot of people around the state now are saying that our county jails have become the mental health treatment centers for the state. Your jail, you feel that way the same way in your jail, isn't you're treating more mental health patients?
Yes, sir, I do. As a matter of fact, from the other side of this, I used to be a member of the Mental Health Association of Clayton County, and we worked to try to bring all the providers to the table and collaborate. Without a doubt, there are more mental health consumers in the Clayton County Jail than there are.
Would they be better served in another type facility than in your jail?
I believe they would.
In your jail, they're only getting drugs to stay quiet and not getting any kind of treatment. Is that correct?
I would hate to say exactly that, but more or less. I mean, that is from a manpower standpoint, that is generally speaking the model of therapy that they receive. They are more medically treated than they are treated in other ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff, and that's a great segue for our next presenter.
Good to see y'all.
Hang on, though, because we may ask you some questions at the end. The mental health issue that is facing our county jails is probably an even greater issue than what is facing the Department of Corrections, although I'm not minimizing in any measure the impact on Department of Corrections of mental health. One of the things that I've been involved in here recently is the last couple of years is the behavioral health issues, developmental disability, behavioral health, settlement with the Department of Justice and some of the needs with the mental health and developmental disability community. And it was in that I met Paul Bolster. Paul's going to come. He is with Supportive Housing Initiative, and he is going to come and share with us his perspective on supportive housing, and appreciate you coming, Mr. Bolster. Thank you so much.
This is a really exciting afternoon to have so much attention placed on the issue of housing and the need for supportive housing. I'm with the director of the Georgia Supportive Housing Association. We have Holly Tree, for example, for a member. Nick Dana is my chair. He's with us. Tom Bowler's in the back of the room. He sometimes does some work for us. And what our association, we have CSBs from across the state that are members. We have matured over a few years. We had 200 people show up to talk about supportive housing for a day in November at the first conference that we have. So I think this is a growing realization that supportive housing is in many different forms can be the solution of what we're doing with different kinds of reform effort. Think about you're reforming the mental health system, and you're reforming the criminal justice system, and eventually maybe we'll reform a little bit of the healthcare system. But what is critical to all of those reforms is that people have a place to live in order to make the treatment effective. If you have no place to live, whether you're being treated with diabetes or you're being treated with schizophrenia or addiction, the chances of that treatment being very successful is, I think, minimal. So that's why because of this general movement in our state to a greater level of reforming these very large systems, we have to put more emphasis on the unique contributions of supportive housing. Now, I've presented you a little video. I think everybody has one. We didn't want to take the time to play it. It has 4 women who stay in supportive housing in Douglas County, supported by the Douglas County Community Service Board. And I'm on there a little bit, but mainly it's 10 minutes to define what supportive housing is. If you watch that, you won't have to listen to a lot of people talking. You'll hear it in the name and the voice of people who are benefiting from it. I provided you some testimony, which I'll go through a little bit, trying not to repeat what everybody's already said. Provided you a little sheet here, which provides some data on how many people we're talking about. You should have that in front of you. And then the third piece that I provided you is a report that's in the process by the Carter Center Mental Health Program. This has wonderful data in it on cost savings of supportive housing. This is the section that they're doing to report on mental health around the state on the housing section. So I might make some referrals to that. I'd encourage you to read all of these pieces to understand kind of where we're going. Let's talk first about mental health reform. It was mentioned, the settlement was mentioned. That's U.S. v. Georgia. It's now about a year and a half old. And in that settlement, the settlement requires the state to move mental health services to the community. It's very specific about how different mental health services at the community level are going to be developed. It's also fairly specific about housing. The service components have gotten a lot of attention. The housing components of that agreement have not. One of the good things that you've done, I mean, the governor and the legislature, I think, has put the money into making the settlement real. And you see that in your 2012 and your 2013 budget with the expansion of mental health services. One of the parts of the settlement said the state will actually help to pay the rent, if you will, is another way, an interesting way to say it, or subsidize the housing for 3,000 people. And that program is underway. You're on a steady kind of incline to meet that 2,000 rent subsidies by the year 2015. That's in most of the planning, and it's acknowledged pretty much by OPB, and it's in the process of going through. The difficulty with the settlement is the settlement goes beyond that, and it says that the state should have the capacity to serve 9,000 people with supportive housing. It doesn't say you have to pay for it, but it should be paid for with other housing resources. Most of those are actually federal resources that you have available. My concern about this is that we're in a year and a half into the settlement, and still there's not a plan being proposed by the administration on how you meet that. If you look at the Carter Center, to give you an idea where the monies potentially come from, I think it's on page 8. There's a little chart here that lists all the different federal sources of funds that could be prioritized for the purpose of supportive housing. Some of them are and some of them aren't. My argument to you and to the legislature as a whole is that it's in your interest to see that these programs are prioritizing supportive housing, because that's the main way that you're going to get to meet the 9,000 unit requirement, 9,000 person requirement in the settlement. So the most important thing I think to be looking at is the housing plan. Where is the plan? How can we get one? And I know that DCA is very much involved in creating one. It's not out yet. I'm a little frustrated, I must admit that it's not there yet. But that's something the legislature should be monitoring, to see that that plan is in place. So the end of fiscal year 2015, this state can point to the federal judge and say, here is our capacity to provide supportive housing for 9,000 people. Now, the numbers are kind of interesting. So let's turn a little bit to criminal justice reform. And here I want to let you look at this chart here a little bit on the numbers. This chart shows the number of people with serious mental illness that were in the correction system in 2011. Over the next side is the number of people discharged in 2010, and it says the complete discharges from corrections are 20,000. The people with serious mental illness are 4,700. Now the next two columns are based on kind of some surveys that we did in the Cobb Jail, the Gwinnett Jail, the DeKalb Jail, and some statistics from Fulton, that when asked a mental health person in the jail, about 20% will say that they are going to be homeless when they get out. And about 12% don't really have any idea where their housing is going to come from. So that's 32% of the people with mental illness who are in the local metro jails here, or the number actually is 3,500. 3,500 people with serious mental illness will be discharged from the metro jails in a year's time to probably to homelessness. That explains why you have recidivism. Now, this 3,500 number, the only thing that's wrong with that is, and we haven't been able to do enough research, is, you know, some of those people are 4 and 5 times. They're the frequent flyers that Kim talked about. They're the $1 million Murrays. So you don't know how many of those very active cases. I have a friend who every time he goes to jail, every time he gets out of jail, comes to my house looking for some help. And I know it's 10 to 15 times a year that he goes through the jail system. Those cases are extremely expensive. And so we need to focus our efforts on how we get mental health, because the issue of mental health reform kind of comes together here with the correctional system. Most of the mental health reform is going to affect the correctional system because that's where the people are. They aren't in our hospitals. Some are in our community. Some have adjusted to their disease, but most of them are in our local jails. I do want to commend the state, the governor, and the budget that's going through right now on 3 particular points. First of all, the Department of Corrections has the creation of 3 200-bed residential treatment facilities that are in the current budget. That's a wonderful sign that the efforts by the special commission is, I think, moving us forward in the right direction. Also in the budget is $10 million you're aware of for alternative courts, for accountability courts or treatment courts. The Chief Justice told the Appropriations Committee that that would create 30 courts, so it's not a whole lot per court. One of the small issues that I think we've already seen today from what Sheriff Kimbrough said is that some of those courts are going to need housing. Very few of those courts can serve the most in need because they aren't in stable housing. I know of only 2 examples, Fulton and DeKalb addiction courts. They do have housing connected to the court. So I would recommend that you look at the application process there and see if communities would be required to create some housing plan when they're receiving the state grant. That would be a specific kind of way to move that court system into the need to provide, stable housing. The RPH program is, I think, a wonderful model, but like Michael said, it only deals with those people who are not mentally ill or having some particular condition. I think that model could be expanded upon to create local opportunities like Holly Tree or other places, or the faith-based addiction facilities. It could be expanded upon, but you'd have to change the length of time. You can't take a person with mental illness and expect the miracles to happen in 3 months, and you can't expect a treatment organization to be able to provide the treatment it needs for $600. Now the thing is, though, when we look at that, we have an expansion of DBHDD mental health capacity. So it may just be a coordination of that new capacity to these kind of facilities so that people with mental illness in those kind of housing programs can actually get the mental health that they need. That's a lot of coordination across departmental lines, from correction to housing to DBHDD, but we're creating the resources that could make that happen. Just a couple more comments about the plan. In the plan, we need to know how many people are being served in how many people in the hospital need this kind of housing. What are the frequent users of emergency rooms that could be housed? The people in the jail and in the prison. I think that we lack a little bit of information or data or research on this supportive housing topic, and I've worked hard on this for many years, but there still isn't the right information that you should have if you're going to invest significantly in supportive housing. I think we need to know what the full need is. I would guess that there's probably 20,000 people in the state that could benefit efficiently and effectively by being in a supportive housing environment, and that those 20,000 people would save public dollars, significant public dollars. I think that the other thing that we need to know is we need to know what housing models are the most effective. There are studies all over the state, all over the country, cost-benefit studies, and there's some in the Carter Center study. One particular one that was done showed that the cost of 60 people prior to the program was $2.2 million. After the program, including program cost, the cost was $1 million. So you had 60 people saving $1 million. That's a study that's in the Carter Center program there. So the goal is to have 9,000 people in supportive housing by 2015. Hopefully each of you will have a conversation with your sheriff. I would recommend that. I don't think anybody here from Clayton, you've already heard your sheriff here, but to go home and talk about this issue with your sheriff, because a lot of this has to come out of local support and local initiatives and a local understanding. Okay, the governor's initiative, I think, on criminal justice reform is a wonderful beginning and putting some new emphasis on these issues. It's going to be dependent on a different kind of approach to housing than we've ever had in the state before. Housing is critical to the success of mental health reform, criminal justice reform, and eventually it's going to be critical to health care reform. So in summary, look for a plan, and DCA I think is going to be the heart of that plan, but it could be the governor needs to be focused on the plan, and do some more research and find alternatives to incarceration and put your energies and efforts behind that. I've sort of talked through this testimony because I hate to read stuff, but I hope I caught everything that's in there.
Thank you, Mr. Bolster. Representative Kidd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Paul, my good friend, Mr. Bolster, we go back a long way, back to my lobby days and his days in the legislature. But my organization was opposed to what he was trying to sell, and we were on a panel at Emory together, and I gave him a contribution from a bunch of people, and he didn't know how to turn it down, so he took it. And been taking contributions ever since. No, but thank you. But you basically said there, and I agree, that there hasn't been a plan from the top of BHDD for the purpose of implementing the agreement.
Well, there is a plan in great detail for implementing the improvements in the community mental health services. There isn't a specific plan, and that to some extent is the fault a little bit of the language in the settlement. The settlement's very specific about the number of ACT teams and intensive case management and other kinds, but there isn't much specific about how they reach the goal of 9,000 people served in supportive housing.
That's my next point. I met with the governor not too long ago, and I said, Governor, I'm not here to talk to you about Milledgeville. I'm not here to talk to you about some state hospital. I'm not here to talk to you about 2011, 2012. I'm here to talk to you about 2013, 14, and 15. Can the state afford to put 9,000 people out in single-dwelling houses, either by purchasing the house, renting the house, buying the insurance, cutting the grass, paying the utilities, paying for the food, paying for the TV, and everything else that goes along with these 9,000 people that we're supposed to put out in single-unit housing in the next couple of years?
I don't know the answer to that, and the settlement doesn't require single-unit housing either. That's a misnomer in the settlement. The settlement says that half of the housing should be scattered site, and the other half can be congregate. So it's not limited to everybody having a little house in the neighborhood. So
would you please tell the director your assessment of that, because the director over there thinks they all have to be single dwellings and they can't be clustered.
that's not correct according to the way I've read the case, and that's what it says.
I want to interject here. No, you're good. I just want to interject something here. Not only there is a group home. It's not in my district. It's in my area. That was established with a HUD grant that required that this be for developmentally disabled. So in order to fulfill their HUD grant, this developer has to put 12 consumers in there that meet that criteria. The Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities has determined that only 49% of the individuals in that particular home can be those consumers. So there are 5 filled and 7 vacant brand new units in that building, because the department interprets that to say that there's no unit that can have more than 49% occupied in that consumer class. That's also an inaccurate interpretation. Would you agree with that?
I think in the area of developmental disabilities, I am not an expert. My wife actually worked for an organization for several years, and I can't quite understand the housing issues there. But the settlement says basically 4 people. I mean, maybe somebody else that has more expertise on that part than I do, but 4 people in a dwelling unit is the limit for developmental disabilities. It also affects whether or not the person can receive the waiver Medicaid services. That's where the restriction comes in. So developmental disability is a very different housing question than the mentally ill.
We were told of the 150 houses that the state of Georgia owns in Baldwin County, that they could not be used for transitional houses for people coming out of the facilities because they're on the state campus. And there are 150 of them sitting there right now, most of them are empty, starting to rot away, that the state owns. You know what I'm talking about. I'm not fussing at you, but...
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'd have to look more into that. I know we've talked about that before, and maybe that's where some public-private partnerships come in, if that housing could be put in private hands and then be used more effectively to serve the population. But there is a big difference in the settlement on the developmental disabilities population as opposed to the mentally ill population or people with addiction. Thank Paul. Yell for Paul. Appreciate it. Okay.
I don't see any more questions, and I know. So Representative Davis just said I can ask questions all night too. But it is almost 4:30, and I just want to thank our presenters today. One of the things that I think is very obvious to us, and probably members, you all knew this before we got here. Hopefully you've picked up on even more the critical position that we're in as a state. If we're going to be successful in our mental health and criminal justice reform, if we're going to be successful in utilizing state funds efficiently, effectively, if we're going to be able to follow evidence-based practices so that we can have success with the mentally ill, the drug addicted, and many times those are co-occurring, and you have both of those with that consumer base. And if we're going to be effective in addressing these issues, we have got to do something about the housing situation and about the need for these individuals to be able to have stable housing in order to be able to begin to assimilate back into the communities. And I think this has been a great opportunity for us to hear about those needs and to be reminded again of the importance of being very mindful of these as we're moving forward in these reform areas. And hopefully we can be successful in doing so. Members, you have any further questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman, for all of us that came today, we want to thank you for making that statement. We need the leadership of the legislature to move forward on the housing front, and it's a difficult thing for you to do because it's different and new, but we really greatly appreciate your support.
Thank you so much. Mr. Nail, can you come back just for 1 or 2 minutes? And by the way, any other presenters, if you have anything else that you would like to add after hearing from other presenters, you can feel free to do that as well. We're going to wrap this up in just a few minutes. We have 647 at least that have paroled out but are still incarcerated because they have no housing.
That's correct.
Do you know the average time between those individuals becoming eligible for parole and actually being released? What is that average length of stay? Do you know the answer to that, or?
I do not. Are you referring to, Chairman, those that by the time they're granted parole to the time they're released?
Yes.
On average, you're going to look at about 30 to 45-day window.
Okay. What about the ones that are the troubled house, the ones with the housing issues are there, and maybe it's the sex offenders or the drug addicts that are staying, I would imagine, considerably longer.
Yes, sir, considerably longer. And I think you hit the point home when you talked about some of these actually max out. So I mean, we've had offenders that have been there 2 years beyond their parole date simply because they have nowhere to go. Even with changes to our internal policy, looking, those type things. One thing I did want to say, and I appreciate Mr. Bolster's comment, but I wanted to make one correction on the RPH. They do, in fact, take mental health, and they do, in fact, take substance abuse. The only ones that do not go to RPH is sex offenders.
Okay.
So I just wanted to make that point of clarification.
Okay. Mr. Nell, one more thing you mentioned was with the offenders with mental illness, specifically, you talked about some of the things that are needed, and one of the things you mentioned was eligible federal government benefits. Now, none of us want to see anyone on government benefits that don't have to be. It would be it would be incredible for us to be able to be in a position to where we could say in the state of Georgia, everybody's self-sufficient and no one has to receive government benefits. Wouldn't that be wonderful? The fact of the matter is that's not the case, and it's not going to be the case. When you're looking at stable homes, or when you're looking at opportunities for people reentering to be able to get their feet back under them, and sometimes those government benefits are necessary to help them get reestablished. One of the things that I was just made aware of this week is that when you're talking about food stamps as a government benefit, I was not aware that that in the state of Georgia, if you have a drug felon on your record, you are banned for life from receiving food stamps. Are you aware of that?
I am not aware being banned for life. I am aware of restrictions. And along those same lines, talking about convicted felons and drug offenses, a lot of people think that government housing, that there's this rule that if you're a drug offender or conviction, you cannot go, and that's the rule across the board. And that's not the correct, that is not correct either. It is up to that individual manager or person over that property to make that decision. So my point is, no, sir, I was not aware of that. And there's a lot of those little innuendos and things that we operate under assumption rather than reality with. So no, sir, I was not
I'll
aware
follow up on that to double check. But the information I was given indicated that, and it was drug felon was the only criminal record that brought about that lifetime ban. But if you were a drug felon, you were banned for life in Georgia from food stamps. I found that interesting.
I was not aware of that.
Anyone else? Any other presenters have anything that you would like to add after? Thank you all so much for coming. I know that this meeting went longer than you probably thought it was going to go when you came. It lasted almost exactly how long I thought it would. I want to have some follow-up. I want to have some follow-up discussions with certainly with the committee about some of these issues, because there's no doubt we've uncovered and we've talked about some things today that we've got to do differently and better. One of the things that Senator Grant and I are co-chairs of the Legislative Behavioral Health Caucus. I will tell you this: one of the things that we've talked about doing is with that Behavioral Health Caucus doing a hearing on housing, dealing specifically with the DOJ settlement. That's a little bit different than what we talked about today. Today we kind of talked about both of those issues a little bit. I think that may be a good next step for us, and I would encourage members of my committee to attend if we do that as a Legislative Behavioral Health Caucus. We may be able to build upon what we talked about today a little bit with that. Thank you all so much. Meeting's adjourned.